The year was 1817, and London's grand society moved like clockwork through its gilded halls and marble corridors. In the heart of Mayfair, where Georgian mansions stood as monuments to inherited privilege, the most elaborate masquerade in English history was about to unfold. The gas lamps flickered against tall windows as carriages rolled past cobblestone streets, their wheels echoing the rhythm of a world built on bloodlines and birthrights. Within the opulent walls of Ashworth House, the Duke of Cumberland hosted his monthly soiree, an event that drew the cream of aristocratic society. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across oil paintings of long-dead ancestors, while servants in pristine livery moved silently between guests, their silver trays gleaming under candlelight. The air thrummed with the soft murmur of refined conversation, punctuated by the gentle rustle of silk gowns and the measured steps of perfectly choreographed social interaction. It was here, among the powdered wigs and jeweled tiaras, that Sebastian Blackwood first appeared. He emerged from a mahogany-paneled anteroom with the confident stride of a man born to command attention. Tall and lean, with penetrating dark eyes and aristocratic features that spoke of noble breeding, he wore his evening attire with the casual elegance that marked true gentility. His black tailcoat was cut to perfection, his white cravat tied in the intricate style favored by the highest echelons of society, and his patent leather shoes gleamed with the polish that only the finest valets could achieve. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the Duke's herald, his voice carrying across the vast ballroom. "His Lordship, Sebastian Blackwood, the Marquis of Ravenshollow." The name rippled through the assembled guests like a stone cast into still water. Ravenshollow, a title that carried whispers of ancient glory and mysterious decline. The estate had been closed for decades, its previous marquis having retreated from society following a scandal that had never been fully explained. Now, it seemed, the line had produced a new heir, one who bore himself with the unmistakable bearing of aristocratic breeding. Sebastian moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his every gesture calculated to convey both confidence and humility. He bowed precisely to the duchesses, kissed the gloved hands of the countesses with just the right amount of reverence, and engaged the earls in conversations that revealed an impressive knowledge of politics, literature, and the subtle art of social navigation. His accent was flawless, the crisp, refined pronunciation that marked the products of Eton and Oxford, with just a hint of the regional inflection that suggested time spent on country estates. "Marquis Ravenshollow," purred Lady Pemberton, a sharp-eyed dowager whose approval could make or break a social reputation. "We had begun to wonder if your family line had simply vanished into the mists of history. Your late father was such a recluse." Sebastian's smile never wavered, though his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his champagne flute. "My father was indeed a private man, Lady Pemberton. He believed that true nobility was demonstrated through action rather than exhibition. I have chosen a different path, one that honors both family tradition and the responsibilities of our rank in these changing times." The response was perfectly calibrated, acknowledging the implied criticism while gently deflecting it back to principles that no one present could question. Lady Pemberton's eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded with grudging respect. This young man understood the game and played it well. As the evening progressed, Sebastian found himself at the center of increasingly important circles. The Earl of Dorchester drew him into a discussion about the latest agricultural innovations on his estates. The Viscount Ashford sought his opinion on the political tensions brewing across the Channel. Each conversation revealed Sebastian's remarkable ability to speak knowledgeably on any subject while revealing very little about himself. "Tell me, Ravenshollow," said the Duke of Cumberland himself, a portly man whose political influence extended directly to the Prince Regent's inner circle, "what are your thoughts on the current state of the succession? These are delicate times, and men of breeding must be prepared to serve the crown when called upon." Sebastian's pause was so brief as to be nearly undetectable, but in that fraction of a second, calculation flickered behind his dark eyes. "I believe, Your Grace, that loyalty to the crown is the foundation of all noble obligation. Whatever challenges may arise, those of us blessed with privilege must be ready to sacrifice personal comfort for the greater good of England. The Duke nodded approvingly. Spoken like a true patriot. We must discuss this further. Perhaps you would join me for dinner next Tuesday? I find myself in need of advisors who understand both tradition and the necessities of our modern age. I would be honored, Your Grace. As the evening drew to a close, Sebastian made his farewells with the same graceful precision that had marked his entire performance. He had been invited to 3 more social gatherings, received 2 offers of investment opportunities, and been subtly approached by a government minister about a potential position in the colonial office. In a single evening, he had established himself as a force to be reckoned with in London society. But as his hired carriage rolled through the darkened streets toward his modest lodgings in a respectable but decidedly non-aristocratic neighborhood, Sebastian allowed his perfect posture to relax for the first time in hours. He pulled off his white gloves and flexed his fingers, noting the slight tremor that betrayed the enormous concentration required to maintain his elaborate fiction. The truth was both simpler and more audacious than anyone could have imagined. Sebastian Blackwood was not the Marquis of Ravenshollow. He was the son of a blacksmith from Yorkshire, born Thomas Hartwell in a sooty village where the sound of hammering iron had been his lullaby. But he possessed something far rarer than noble blood, a brilliant mind, an eidetic memory, and the kind of desperate ambition that could transform a common-born bastard into a convincing aristocrat. For 3 years, he had studied every aspect of noble life with the intensity of a scholar and the cunning of a spy. He had learned to fence, to dance, to speak French and Latin with the fluency expected of his supposed class. He had memorized genealogies, heraldic symbols, and the intricate web of relationships that bound the aristocracy together. Most crucially, he had discovered that the real Marquis of Ravenshollow had died childless and forgotten in a continental exile, leaving no heir and no one who remembered the family well enough to challenge an impostor. Tonight had been his debut, and it had exceeded his wildest expectations. But Sebastian knew that this was merely the first movement in a symphony of deception that would either elevate him to unimaginable heights or destroy him utterly. For his ambitions extended far beyond mere social acceptance. He intended to position himself so close to the throne that when the opportunity arose, he could reach out and claim the crown itself. In his cramped rooms above a tailor's shop, Sebastian carefully hung his borrowed finery and retrieved a leather portfolio from its hiding place beneath loose floorboards. Inside were documents, maps, and detail plans that represented months of meticulous preparation. At the center of it all was a family tree. Not his own, but one he had created to establish his fictional lineage as a distant but legitimate claimant to the English throne through an obscure medieval connection. The plan was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. But as Sebastian studied his false documents by candlelight, he felt no fear, only the cold satisfaction of a masterpiece in progress. 3 weeks after his triumphant debut at the Duke of Cumberland's soiree, Sebastian had transformed from an unknown provincial marquis into one of London's most sought-after gentlemen. His invitation to dine with the Duke had led to a cascade of social opportunities, each more prestigious than the last. The ton had embraced him with the enthusiasm they reserved for genuine novelties, and Sebastian had played his role to perfection. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of White's Gentlemen's Club as Sebastian settled into a leather armchair beside Lord Pemberton, Lady Pemberton's equally sharp-eyed husband. The club's morning ritual proceeded with clockwork precision. The rustle of newspapers, the soft clink of china against silver, and the low murmur of conversation that revealed the true business of empire, the informal networks that actually governed England. "Extraordinary thing about the Prince Regent's health," murmured Lord Pemberton, not looking up from his copy of the Times. "They say his physicians are gravely concerned about his condition. All that excess finally catching up with him, I'd wager." Sebastian stirred his tea with measured calm, though his pulse quickened. This was precisely the kind of intelligence that made his position invaluable. Indeed, troubling news. One hopes His Royal Highness will recover fully, though one must also consider the implications for the realm should contingencies arise. Lord Pemberton's eyes sharpened. "Quite so. The succession is hardly straightforward. Is it? His daughter Princess Charlotte was to be our future, God rest her soul, but her death in childbirth left us in rather uncharted waters. The Duke of Clarence stands next in line, but there are those who question whether he possesses the qualities necessary for effective leadership. Difficult times require exceptional leadership, Sebastian agreed, his tone carefully neutral. The crown must rest upon someone capable of uniting the nation and commanding respect both at home and abroad. It was a perfectly reasonable statement that could be interpreted in multiple ways. Exactly the kind of careful ambiguity that had made Sebastian invaluable to the political circles he was infiltrating. Lord Pemberton nodded thoughtfully, filing away Sebastian's response for future consideration. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sir Reginald Ashford, a thin-faced man whose position in the Colonial Office gave him access to information that could make or break political careers. Sir Reginald's expression was unusually grave as he approached their table. "Gentlemen, I wonder if I might have a word." Sir Reginald's voice carried an undertone of urgency that immediately commanded attention. Sebastian and Lord Pemberton exchanged glances before Sir Reginald continued in a lowered voice. "There have been developments regarding certain foreign influences attempting to destabilize our government. We have reason to believe that Napoleon supporters on the continent are funding efforts to create confusion about the succession. In times like these, it becomes crucial to know exactly where loyalties lie." Sebastian felt a cold thrill of recognition. This was the opening he had been waiting for. The opportunity to position himself not just as a social curiosity, but as a potential solution to England's political uncertainties. "Sir Reginald," Sebastian said, leaning forward with the earnest intensity that had served him so well, "if there are threats to the crown, then every true Englishman must be prepared to serve. My family has always stood ready to answer the call of duty, regardless of personal cost." Sir Reginald studied Sebastian's face with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating loyalty and competence. "Your family history suggests a tradition of service, Lord Ravenshollow, though it has been discreet in recent years. Perhaps it is time for that tradition to resurface." "I am entirely at your disposal," Sebastian replied without hesitation. Over the following days, Sebastian found himself drawn deeper into the shadowy world of political intelligence and contingency planning. Sir Reginald introduced him to a select circle of men who met in private dining rooms and bookline studies, their conversations ranging from diplomatic negotiations to military preparations. Sebastian's role was ostensibly that of an advisor, but he quickly understood that he was being evaluated for something far more significant. The key to Sebastian's success lay not just in his performance as a nobleman, but in his genuine brilliance. His years of desperate self-education had given him a breadth of knowledge that impressed even the most accomplished men of his supposed class. He could discuss military strategy with veteran officers, economic policy with treasury officials, and constitutional law with barristers. More importantly, he possessed the kind of strategic thinking that came from having fought for every advantage he had ever gained. "The fellow has real insight," Sir Reginald confided to Lord Pemberton after a particularly productive strategy session. His analysis of the continental situation was remarkably astute. "There's something about his perspective. Perhaps growing up in relative isolation has given him a clarity that we court-bred politicians sometimes lack." What Sir Reginald interpreted as noble detachment was actually the cold objectivity of an outsider who understood that survival depended on reading situations accurately. Sebastian had spent his entire life studying power from the outside, which gave him an understanding of its mechanisms that those born to it often lacked. The breakthrough came during a dinner party at Lord Pemberton's Belgravia mansion. The guests included several members of Parliament, 2 bishops, and a general whose advice carried weight with the military establishment. The conversation turned to the question of leadership during times of crisis. "The problem," declared Bishop Thornton, a corpulent man whose political influence rivaled that of many cabinet ministers, "is that we lack a clear focal point for national unity. The Prince Regent's excesses have damaged the monarchy's reputation, and his heir presumptive lacks the presence to inspire confidence." England needs a leader who embodies both traditional values and modern capabilities. Indeed, agreed General Morrison, whose weathered face bore the scars of campaigns in India and the Peninsula. In my experience, effective leadership often emerges from unexpected quarters. Sometimes the most valuable commanders are those who have proven themselves through merit rather than birth. Sebastian sensed the moment when the conversation shifted from general principles to specific possibilities. Eyes began to turn toward him with a new kind of evaluation. He had been carefully building toward this moment for weeks, establishing himself not just as a social equal, but as someone whose opinions carried weight. "Gentlemen," Sebastian said, his voice carrying just enough gravitas to command attention, "I believe we face a choice between accepting decline or embracing renewal. England's greatness has always rested on our ability to adapt our institutions while preserving our essential character. Perhaps what we need is not just competent administration, but visionary leadership that can unite tradition with progress." The words hung in the air with the weight of possibility. Sebastian had not explicitly suggested anything treasonous, but he had articulated a vision that could be interpreted as supporting significant change in England's leadership structure. Bishop Thornton leaned forward, his small eyes bright with interest. "And where, in your estimation, might such visionary leadership be found?" Sebastian met his gaze steadily. "I believe it exists wherever genuine devotion to England's welfare takes precedence over personal ambition. The crown belongs not to any individual, but to the nation itself. Sometimes the most qualified guardian of that trust may not be the most obvious candidate." The room fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. Sebastian had just articulated, in the most diplomatic possible terms, the argument for his own eventual elevation to the throne. He had done so without committing treason, while simultaneously demonstrating exactly the kind of careful intelligence that such a position would require. Lord Pemberton broke the silence with a thoughtful nod. "Fascinating perspective, Lord Ravenshollow. I think we should discuss these ideas further in a more private setting." Sebastian inclined his head gracefully. "I am, as always, at your service." As the evening concluded and guests began to take their leave, Sebastian realized that he had crossed a crucial threshold. He was no longer simply impersonating a nobleman. He was being seriously considered as a potential alternative to the established succession. The game had become deadly serious, but Sebastian felt only the cold satisfaction of a plan proceeding exactly as designed. But what Sebastian did not know was that among the servants clearing away the evening's refreshments was a young woman whose sharp intelligence and careful observation would soon pose the greatest threat to his carefully constructed deception. Lady Eleanor Fairfax, the Duke of Cumberland's ward, had been listening from the servants' corridors, and something about the mysterious Marquis of Ravenshollow had triggered her well-trained instincts for detecting fraud. Lady Eleanor Fairfax possessed the kind of beauty that belonged in portrait galleries. Auburn hair that caught light like burnished copper, emerald eyes that missed nothing, and the graceful carriage that marked generations of aristocratic breeding. But beneath her perfect exterior lay a mind as sharp as any barrister's and a determination that had been forged by surviving the treacherous waters of court intrigue since childhood. As the ward of the Duke of Cumberland, Eleanor had grown up in the shadowy spaces between power and politics. She had learned to read faces, to interpret silences, and to detect the subtle inconsistencies that marked lies from truth. It was this training that had made her increasingly suspicious of the charming Marquis of Ravenshollow, who had so quickly ingratiated himself with London's most influential circles. The morning after Lord Pemberton's dinner party, Eleanor found herself walking through the Cumberland Estate's formal gardens, ostensibly admiring the late spring blooms, but actually wrestling with growing concerns about Sebastian's true identity. Something about his perfect performance nagged at her consciousness. He was almost too flawless, too precisely what everyone expected a mysterious noble heir to be. She was examining a particularly fine rose bush when footsteps on the gravel path announced another early morning visitor to the gardens. Turning, she saw Sebastian himself approaching, his tall figure elegant even in the casual riding attire of buff breeches and dark blue coat. "Lady Eleanor," Sebastian said, sweeping into a perfect bow. How delightful to encounter you in such peaceful surroundings. The Duke's gardens are renowned throughout London for their beauty. Lord Ravenshollow, Eleanor replied with a curtsy that was precisely correct and utterly distant. Indeed, I find gardens conducive to reflection. They remind us that appearances can be deceiving. What seems most beautiful often requires the most careful cultivation. Sebastian's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly at her words. Eleanor's tone carried an undertone that suggested deeper meaning, and his survival instincts immediately went on alert. A profound observation, Lady Eleanor. Nature does indeed teach us about the relationship between effort and achievement. They began walking together along the precisely maintained paths, their conversation maintaining the surface courtesy expected of their ranks, while both participants engaged in a more dangerous form of communication through subtext and implication. Tell me about your estates, Lord Ravenshollow, Eleanor said, pausing beside a fountain where water cascaded over marble cherubs. Ravenshollow has been closed to society for so long that one begins to wonder what life must have been like in such isolation. Peaceful, Lady Eleanor. My father believed that true education came from books rather than balls, from contemplation rather than conversation. I spent my youth learning to understand the world from a distance before venturing to engage with it directly. It was a clever answer that explained both his knowledge and his slight unfamiliarity with certain social nuances. But Eleanor detected something in his tone, a careful precision that suggested rehearsal rather than genuine memory. How fascinating, she murmured. And your mother? The late Marchioness must have found such isolation challenging. Sebastian's pause was fractional, but Eleanor caught it. My mother died when I was quite young. I remember her more as an impression of gentleness than as specific details. Another careful non-answer that revealed nothing while appearing to share something personal. Eleanor's suspicions crystallized into near certainty, but she maintained her outward composure with the skill of someone trained in diplomatic deception. I lost my own parents young, Eleanor said softly, allowing genuine emotion to color her voice. Sometimes I wonder if our memories shape us more than our actual experiences. We become who we believe we should be rather than who we actually are. The comment hit Sebastian like a perfectly aimed blade between armor plates. This young woman was not making polite conversation. She was conducting an interrogation disguised as social pleasantry. He found himself simultaneously alarmed and impressed by her skill. You speak with unusual wisdom for one so young, Lady Eleanor. Perhaps loss teaches us to value truth more highly than those who have never faced genuine adversity. Perhaps, Eleanor agreed, studying his face with the intensity of someone examining a potentially valuable but questionable work of art. Though I have observed that those who have experienced genuine loss often recognize it in others. There is a quality of authentic pain that cannot be counterfeited. The conversation was becoming dangerous, but Sebastian found himself unwilling to retreat. There was something about Eleanor's intelligence and courage that drew him despite the threat she represented. For the first time since beginning his masquerade, he was engaging with someone as an intellectual equal rather than a mark to be manipulated. And what have you observed about me, Lady Eleanor? Sebastian asked, allowing a note of challenge to enter his voice. Eleanor met his gaze directly, her emerald eyes reflecting both suspicion and something that might have been curiosity. I observe a man of considerable intelligence and remarkable self-control, someone who has clearly invested enormous effort in perfecting his presentation to the world. The question that intrigues me is whether such perfection reflects genuine nobility or exceptional artifice. They had moved beyond subtext into direct confrontation, though their voices remained perfectly modulated for anyone who might be listening from the mansion's windows. Sebastian realized that he had reached a crucial decision point. He could attempt to deflect her suspicions, or he could take the enormous risk of treating her as an ally rather than an enemy. Lady Eleanor, Sebastian said, lowering his voice to ensure privacy, I suspect you and I understand each other better than either of us might wish. Perhaps we should consider whether our respective talents might be better employed in cooperation rather than opposition. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly at the implicit admission. Are you suggesting that you are not what you appear to be, Lord Ravenshollow? I am suggesting that in times of political uncertainty, the distinction between appearance and reality becomes less important than the question of ultimate loyalty. England faces challenges that may require unconventional solutions from unconventional sources. It was a masterful response that admitted nothing while acknowledging everything. Eleanor found herself facing a choice between exposing what she was increasingly certain was an elaborate fraud or becoming complicit in whatever larger scheme Sebastian represented. Unconventional solutions, Eleanor repeated thoughtfully, such as supporting alternative claims to succession. Sebastian's stillness confirmed her suspicion that she had identified the true scope of his ambitions. They stood beside the fountain in complete silence for several long moments, the sound of falling water providing cover for their extraordinary conversation. Lady Eleanor, Sebastian finally said, I believe you possess the intelligence to understand that England's current situation may require choices between loyalty to specific individuals and loyalty to the nation's welfare. Sometimes the greatest service to the crown involves ensuring that the crown rests upon the most capable shoulders. Eleanor felt her heart racing as the full implications of his words became clear. She was being invited to participate in what amounted to a conspiracy to alter the royal succession. The rational response would be to immediately inform her guardian and see Sebastian arrested for treason. But as she studied his face, Eleanor saw something that gave her pause. Behind the calculated charm and careful performance was genuine conviction. Whatever Sebastian's true identity, his devotion to England appeared authentic. Moreover, Eleanor's own observations of the current political situation had led her to similar concerns about the quality of leadership the nation might expect from the established succession. Such decisions, Eleanor said carefully, would require absolute confidence in the alternative candidate's qualifications and character. Naturally, Sebastian agreed, though I would suggest that the truest test of character lies not in inherited privilege, but in demonstrated ability to serve effectively under pressure. Eleanor found herself at a crossroads that would determine not just Sebastian's fate, but her own. In that moment, looking into his dark eyes, she made a decision that surprised her with its audacity. Lord Ravenshollow, she said, perhaps you would join me for tea tomorrow afternoon? I find myself curious to learn more about your perspectives on England's future. Sebastian's smile was the first genuinely spontaneous expression Eleanor had seen from him. I would be honored, Lady Eleanor. As they parted company and walked toward the mansion by separate paths, both realized that their conversation had fundamentally altered the nature of Sebastian's conspiracy. Eleanor Fairfax was now either his most valuable ally or his most dangerous enemy, and neither was certain which role she would ultimately choose to play. But what neither suspected was that their garden conversation had been observed by sharp eyes hidden behind bedroom curtains, and that word of the mysterious understanding between Lady Eleanor and the enigmatic Marquis would soon reach ears that could transform personal intrigue into matters of life and death. The private tea service in Eleanor's sitting room had been arranged with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that marked truly significant occasions. Chinese porcelain caught afternoon light from tall windows that overlooked the Cumberland Estate's manicured grounds, while silver service gleamed against ivory tablecloth. But the careful domesticity of the setting could not disguise the extraordinary nature of the conversation about to unfold. Sebastian arrived precisely at the appointed hour, his appearance flawless as always, but his manner subtly different from their previous encounters. Gone was the performed charm that had marked his interactions with London society. In its place was the focused intensity of someone preparing for a crucial negotiation. Lady Eleanor, Sebastian said as he settled into the chair opposite her, I find myself in the unusual position of hoping that yesterday's conversation was not merely the product of garden air and morning whimsy. Eleanor poured tea with steady hands despite the racing of her pulse. I assure you, Lord Ravenshollow, that I never speak carelessly about matters of such gravity. Though I confess that sleep came rather reluctantly last night as I contemplated the implications of our discussion. And what conclusions did your contemplation reach? Eleanor set down the delicate porcelain teapot and met his gaze directly. That England's current situation is indeed precarious, that conventional solutions may prove inadequate, and that extraordinary circumstances sometimes justify extraordinary measures. Sebastian felt a surge of triumph, mixed with genuine admiration. Eleanor had chosen alliance over exposure, but her decision appeared to be based on careful analysis rather than mere attraction to intrigue. Then perhaps, Sebastian said, leaning forward slightly, you would be interested in learning the complete scope of what those extraordinary measures might entail. Over the next hour, Sebastian revealed the full audacity of his plan. He explained how he had identified the opportunity created by the uncertain succession, how he had positioned himself within the networks that actually controlled English politics, and how he intended to present himself as a legitimate alternative when the inevitable crisis arrived. He spoke of documents that established his fictional claim, of alliances being carefully cultivated, and of the growing number of influential men who had begun to see him as a solution to England's leadership crisis. Eleanor listened with the fascination of someone witnessing a masterpiece of strategic thinking, even as she grappled with the moral complexity of what she was hearing. The scope is breathtaking, she admitted. But surely you understand the risks? If your true identity were discovered. Death, Sebastian said simply, without question or appeal, which is why I require absolute certainty about the loyalty of anyone who shares this knowledge. And what makes you believe that I will prove loyal rather than horrified? Sebastian's smile carried a warmth that transformed his entire appearance. Because, Lady Eleanor, I believe you possess something remarkably rare among the aristocracy, a genuine love of England that transcends personal advantage. You could have exposed me yesterday and gained considerable credit with your guardian. Instead, you chose to investigate further. That suggests someone capable of seeing beyond immediate circumstances to larger possibilities. Eleanor felt her heart skip at his words, recognizing both the compliment and the challenge they represented. You speak of love of England, but what of love itself? Surely someone embarking on such an ambitious deception has no room for personal attachment. The question hung between them with unexpected weight. Sebastian had not anticipated that his growing attraction to Eleanor would become a factor in the negotiations, but he found himself unable to dismiss the emotional dimension of their alliance. I confess, Sebastian said carefully, that my calculations did not account for encountering someone whose intelligence and courage would prove so compelling. Perhaps that is a weakness that will ultimately prove my undoing. Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at his admission. Despite the extraordinary circumstances, despite the danger and deception, she was falling in love with this remarkable man who had dared to reach for a crown through sheer force of will and brilliance. Perhaps, Eleanor said softly, it is not a weakness, but the element that transforms ambition into something worthy of success. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the sitting room door. Eleanor's maid entered with obvious agitation, curtsying hastily before speaking. My lady, forgive the intrusion, but the Duke requires your immediate presence in his study. He specifically requests that Lord Ravenshollow accompany you. Eleanor and Sebastian exchanged glances that communicated volumes. Had their conspiracy been discovered? Was this summons the beginning of the end of Sebastian's elaborate charade? Of course, Eleanor said with perfect composure. Please inform His Grace that we will attend him directly. The walk through Cumberland House's marble corridors felt like a journey to judgment. Sebastian's mind raced through possibilities, calculating escape routes and emergency contingencies while maintaining the outward calm that had served him so well. Eleanor walked beside him with the dignified bearing that had been bred into her bones, though her thoughts were equally turbulent. They found the Duke of Cumberland waiting in his oak-paneled study, surrounded by the leather-bound volumes and portrait-lined walls that spoke of generations of accumulated power. But the Duke was not alone. Sir Reginald Ashford stood beside the massive desk, his thin face grave with official concern. Lady Eleanor, Lord Ravenshollow, the Duke said without preamble, We find ourselves facing a situation that requires both delicacy and decisive action. Sir Reginald has brought intelligence that affects us all. Sir Reginald stepped forward, his manner carrying the weight of government authority. My lords, my lady, we have received disturbing reports about foreign agents operating within London society. Napoleon supporters appear to be funding efforts to create confusion about the succession, possibly including the introduction of false claimants to noble titles. Sebastian felt his blood turn to ice, but his expression remained perfectly controlled. This was the moment he had dreaded, the possibility that official investigation would uncover his deception. How shocking, Eleanor said with just the right note of aristocratic outrage. Surely our security services are capable of identifying such infiltrators. Indeed they are, Sir Reginald replied, his eyes fixed on Sebastian's face. Which is why I must ask you directly, Lord Ravenshollow, are you absolutely certain that your documentation is above reproach? In times like these, even the appearance of irregularity could prove unfortunate. Sebastian met Sir Reginald's gaze with the steady confidence that had carried him through months of deception. Sir Reginald, I understand your concerns, and I appreciate the gravity of the situation. My family's records are naturally at your disposal for any examination you deem necessary. I would welcome the opportunity to demonstrate the authenticity of my lineage. It was a calculated gamble of extraordinary audacity. Sebastian was betting that his forged documents were sophisticated enough to pass official scrutiny, and that the chaos of incomplete records from previous generations would provide sufficient cover for his fiction. The Duke nodded approvingly. Spoken like a true gentleman. Sir Reginald, I trust this addresses your concerns about Lord Ravenshollow's credentials. Sir Reginald's expression remained neutral, but Sebastian detected a slight relaxation in his posture. Naturally, Your Grace, though I hope Lord Ravenshollow understands that verification procedures may be thorough. I would expect nothing less, Sebastian replied. England's security must take precedence over personal convenience. As the formal interview concluded and pleasantries were exchanged, Eleanor marveled at Sebastian's performance. Under pressure that would have broken lesser men, he had not only maintained his composure, but had actually strengthened his position by appearing eager to cooperate with official investigation. But as they left the Duke's study, both Eleanor and Sebastian understood that the stakes of their conspiracy had just risen dramatically. They were no longer merely playing games with social acceptance. They were now engaged in a deadly, serious competition with professional intelligence services. The game had become a matter of life and death, and the next move would determine whether Sebastian's audacious plan would achieve its ultimate goal or end in catastrophic exposure. 3 days after the tense interview in the Duke's study, Sebastian's world began to fracture with the inexorable precision of a timepiece winding down to its final moment. The morning brought news that sent ice through his veins. Sir Reginald's investigation had uncovered discrepancies in the Ravenshollow estate records that demanded immediate explanation. Sebastian stood in his modest lodgings, staring at the official summons that had arrived with the dawn post. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, not from fear, but from the enormous effort required to maintain control as his carefully constructed world threatened to collapse around him. 3 years of meticulous planning, months of perfect performance, and the growing hope that he might actually achieve the impossible were all balanced on the knife's edge of the next 24 hours. A soft knock at his door interrupted his dark contemplation. Sebastian quickly concealed the summons before admitting his visitor, expecting his landlord or perhaps a messenger with additional unwelcome news. Instead, Eleanor Fairfax entered his rooms wrapped in a dark cloak that concealed her identity but could not disguise her unmistakable bearing. Eleanor, Sebastian breathed, shock momentarily overriding his careful self-control. You cannot be here. If you were seen. I came through the service entrances, Eleanor said, pushing back her hood to reveal eyes bright with determination and something that might have been tears. Sebastian, I know about the summons. My guardian's correspondence is not as private as he believes. Sebastian felt his heart clench at her use of his chosen name. In Eleanor's voice, it sounded less like an assumed identity and more like the person he had begun to believe he might actually become. Then you understand that this is likely farewell, Sebastian said with quiet dignity. I will not compound my crimes by attempting to flee. When Sir Reginald's investigation concludes, I will face whatever consequences await with as much honor as a fraud can claim. Eleanor stepped closer, her gloved hands reaching out to grasp his shoulders. You are not a fraud. You are the most brilliant, capable man I have ever encountered. Your birth may be humble, but your character is noble in every way that matters. Character does not alter the fact that I have committed treason, Sebastian replied, though he could not resist covering her hands with his own. Nor does it change the reality that loving you was an indulgence I could not afford. Love, Eleanor repeated, her voice catching on the word. Sebastian, if you must face judgment, then let us at least speak truth to each other in what time remains. I love you, not the Marquis of Ravenshollow, not the character you have created, but the extraordinary man who dared to dream of lifting himself to a throne through pure force of will. Sebastian pulled her into his arms with desperate tenderness, knowing that this moment of honesty might be their last. Eleanor, my darling girl, you are the one pure thing in all of this deception. If I regret anything, it is that I did not have the courage to abandon this madness and simply ask you to love Thomas Hartwell, blacksmith's son. I would have, Eleanor whispered against his chest. Birth means nothing compared to the content of a man's heart and mind. They stood together in the shabby room, aristocrat and pretender, sharing the kind of perfect understanding that comes only when all pretense has been stripped away. But their moment of peace was shattered by urgent knocking at the door. Ravenshollow. Sir Reginald's voice carried the authority of official business and barely controlled anger. Open this door immediately. We have matters to discuss that will not wait. Eleanor pulled away from Sebastian's embrace, her face pale but resolute. There may still be a way, she whispered urgently. Trust me. Before Sebastian could protest, Eleanor had moved to open the door herself, revealing Sir Reginald accompanied by two stern-faced men whose bearing marked them as professional investigators. Lady Eleanor, Sir Reginald said, his surprise evident. This is most irregular. I must insist that you withdraw while we conduct official business. I think not, Sir Reginald, Eleanor replied with the imperious tone that was her birthright. You see, I believe your investigation has uncovered certain irregularities that I am uniquely positioned to explain. Sebastian felt his world shift as Eleanor stepped forward with the confidence of someone playing a card she had held in reserve. What was she doing? Surely she would not attempt to share his guilt by claiming complicity? Lady Eleanor, Sir Reginald said warningly, you are treading on dangerous ground. If you possess information relevant to this investigation, you must reveal it immediately. Eleanor lifted her chin with aristocratic disdain. Very well, Sir Reginald. The truth is that Lord Ravenshollow's unconventional background was known to certain members of my guardian's inner circle from the beginning. His elevation to the position of Marquis was arranged deliberately as part of a larger strategy to test the loyalty of various political factions. The words hit the room like a thunderbolt. Sebastian stared at Eleanor in amazement as she wove an explanation that was both audacious and potentially believable. You see, Eleanor continued smoothly, the government has been concerned about foreign influence and the possibility of false claimants being introduced into society. What better way to test our security systems than to introduce our own carefully controlled false claimant and observe who proves susceptible to treasonous suggestions? Sir Reginald's face cycled through surprise, calculation, and dawning possibility. You're suggesting that Lord Ravenshollow is an agent of the Crown? I'm suggesting that certain highly placed individuals deemed it prudent to determine exactly which members of society might prove vulnerable to supporting alternative claims to the throne. The results have been illuminating. Sebastian realized what Eleanor was doing. She was offering the government a way to save face while transforming his conspiracy into an officially sanctioned operation. It was brilliant, dangerous, and might actually work if Sir Reginald was willing to accept the fiction. And the documents supporting his identity? Sir Reginald asked, his tone suggesting that he was testing the credibility of Eleanor's explanation. Expertly crafted for the purpose, Eleanor replied without hesitation. Though I must say that Lord Ravenshallow's performance has exceeded all expectations. He has proven remarkably effective at encouraging certain individuals to reveal their willingness to consider alternative arrangements. The room fell silent as Sir Reginald weighed the implications of Eleanor's revelation. Sebastian could see the calculation in the man's eyes. Accepting this explanation would transform a potential scandal into a successful intelligence operation. Rejecting it would mean admitting that foreign agents had successfully penetrated English society under his watch. Most extraordinary, Sir Reginald finally said, though I confess that I was not made aware of this operation through normal channels. Naturally not, Eleanor replied with perfect confidence. Operations of this sensitivity require the most limited distribution of information. I am authorized to confirm the details only because circumstances have made continued secrecy impossible. Sebastian held his breath as Sir Reginald made his decision. The next words would determine whether he faced the gallows or emerged from this crisis with his position not just intact, but officially sanctioned. In that case, Sir Reginald said slowly, I believe our investigation can be concluded satisfactorily. Though I trust that Lord Ravenshollow understands the delicate nature of his position going forward. Absolutely, Sebastian replied, managing to keep his voice steady despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. I remain, as always, entirely at the service of the crown. As Sir Reginald and his companions took their leave, Sebastian and Eleanor found themselves alone with the echoes of the most audacious lie either had ever told. They had transformed treason into patriotism, conspiracy into service, and love into loyalty. But as they embraced in relief and amazement, neither realized that their salvation had come at a price that would soon demand payment in ways they could never have anticipated. 6 months had passed since Eleanor's desperate gambit had transformed Sebastian from traitor to agent, and a masquerade had taken on a life entirely beyond his original imagination. The Prince Regent's health had continued to deteriorate, creating exactly the succession crisis that Sebastian had initially hoped to exploit. But now, instead of positioning himself as a usurper, he found himself genuinely serving as a secret advisor to the very government he had once planned to overthrow. The irony was not lost on him as he sat in the Duke of Cumberland's private study on a cold December evening, reviewing intelligence reports about genuine foreign attempts to destabilize the monarchy. What had begun as an elaborate fraud had evolved into authentic service, and Sebastian found himself using his considerable abilities in defense of the crown he had once coveted. Remarkable work, Ravenshollow, the Duke said, studying Sebastian's analysis of continental political movements. Your insights into the psychology of conspiracy have proven invaluable. One might almost think you possessed personal experience with such matters. Sebastian smiled with genuine humor. I believe, Your Grace, that understanding one's enemies requires a certain sympathy for their methods, if not their goals. The conversation was interrupted by Eleanor's entrance, resplendent in a gown of midnight blue silk that complemented her auburn hair and emerald eyes. In the months since their crisis, she had become Sebastian's official liaison with the government's intelligence operations, a role that allowed them to work together while maintaining the fiction of their professional relationship. Gentlemen, Eleanor said, settling gracefully into a chair beside the fireplace, I bring news from Westminster that will interest you both considerably. The Duke raised an eyebrow. The succession question? Indeed. The Prince Regent's physicians have informed the Privy Council that His Royal Highness may not survive the winter. The Duke of Clarence will assume the throne, but there is considerable concern about his stability. Certain members of Parliament have begun discussing the possibility of a Regency Council to provide guidance during the transition. Sebastian felt his pulse quicken. The moment he had originally planned to exploit through deception had arrived, but now he faced it as a legitimate player in the political process. And the composition of such a council? The Duke inquired. Eleanor's eyes met Sebastian's with a significance that only he could fully appreciate. There's growing support for including individuals who have demonstrated both loyalty to the crown and exceptional capability in matters of state. Personal birth appears to be less important than proven competence and absolute dedication to England's welfare. The Duke nodded thoughtfully. Men like Lord Ravenshollow, you mean? His work over these past months has certainly demonstrated both qualities. Sebastian felt the weight of possibility settling around him like a mantle. What he had originally sought to steal through fraud was now being offered as a reward for genuine service. The crown that had once represented the ultimate prize in a game of deception had become something far more precious, a responsibility to be earned through merit. Your Grace, Sebastian said carefully, if such service is desired, I can offer nothing more valuable than my complete dedication to England's welfare. Whatever role might be deemed appropriate, I would consider it the greatest honor of my life. Over the following weeks, as the Prince Regent's condition worsened and preparations for transition intensified, Sebastian found himself at the center of discussions that would reshape the monarchy itself. The Regency Council that emerged represented a new model of governance, one that balanced traditional authority with demonstrated competence. When the Prince Regent finally passed on a bitter January morning, the succession proceeded with a smoothness that surprised everyone involved. The Duke of Clarence became King William IV, but real power rested with the Regency Council that included Sebastian as one of its most influential members. The coronation took place on a crisp spring day that seemed to promise renewal for the entire realm. Sebastian stood among the highest nobles of the land, no longer as an impostor, but as a man who had earned his place through extraordinary service. The robes he wore were not stolen, but granted. The honors he received, not fraudulent, but genuine. But the true coronation took place later that evening, in the private chapel of Cumberland House, where Sebastian and Eleanor were married in a ceremony attended only by those who knew the full truth of their remarkable story. The Duke of Cumberland himself performed the service, speaking words that carried special meaning for a couple whose love had been forged in the crucible of dangerous deception. Sebastian, Eleanor whispered as they exchanged vows. When I first suspected you were not what you seemed, I never imagined you were actually far more than you appeared. My darling Eleanor, Sebastian replied, his voice thick with emotion. You saw through my deception to find the man I was meant to become. You transformed my greatest lie into my greatest truth. As they kissed to seal their union, Sebastian reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him from a blacksmith shop in Yorkshire to the highest circles of English power. He had set out to steal a crown through fraud and ended up earning something far more valuable: genuine respect, authentic love, and the opportunity to serve the nation he had always claimed to cherish. The wedding feast continued long into the night, with toasts offered to the new Lord and Lady Ravenshollow by men who had become genuine friends rather than marks to be manipulated. Sir Reginald raised his glass with particular warmth, noting that the couple represented the best of what England could achieve when talent was allowed to flourish regardless of birth. Later, as Sebastian and Eleanor stood together on the terrace overlooking the Cumberland Gardens where their love had first bloomed, they watched the lights of London sparkle in the distance like earthbound stars. Do you ever regret it? Eleanor asked softly. The path not taken? You might have achieved your original goal through deception. Sebastian pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of roses from her hair. How could I regret a path that led me to you? The crown I thought I wanted was nothing compared to the life I never knew I needed. And what of Thomas Hartwell, blacksmith's son? Do you miss him? Sebastian smiled, his expression peaceful in a way that would have been impossible during his months of deception. Thomas Hartwell was never truly real. He was just potential waiting to be fulfilled. Sebastian Blackwood, Lord Ravenshollow, husband to the most remarkable woman in England and servant to the crown he once coveted. That man is real in ways I never believed possible. As midnight approached and their wedding day drew to a close, Sebastian and Eleanor made their way to their private chambers, secure in the knowledge that their love had not only survived the trials of conspiracy and deception, but had been strengthened by them. They had learned that the most valuable things in life could not be stolen or counterfeited. They could only be earned through courage, intelligence, and a willingness to become worthy of the dreams one dared to pursue. The false Marquis had become a true lord, not through the accident of birth, but through the content of his character. The plan to steal the crown had evolved into genuine service to the realm, and the deception that had brought them together had been transformed into the most honest love either had ever known. In the end, Sebastian Blackwood had discovered that the greatest victory was not in taking what belonged to others, but in becoming someone worthy of receiving what life had to offer. The crown he had thought he wanted paled in comparison to the kingdom he had found in Eleanor's love and the nobility he had achieved through genuine service to something greater than himself. The story of the false Marquis had become the tale of a true man, and in that transformation lay a truth more valuable than any throne: that the highest titles are not inherited but earned, not claimed but granted by those who recognize authentic worth when they encounter it. As dawn broke over London, Lord and Lady Ravenshollow slept peacefully in each other's arms, their dreams filled not with schemes of deception, but with visions of the genuine life they would build together in service to love, honor, and the England they both cherished above all earthly ambitions.